It's earnings season, and we are continuing to hear about how companies are faring in these very turbulent times. Today, we're talking about Meta's Q2 earnings report and earnings call. Meta, formerly known as Facebook, of course, just disclosed that its division working on tech and hardware for the Metaverse suffered losses of $2.8 billion this quarter, which brings the total losses this year to around $5.77 billion. The Metaverse division, which is called Reality Labs, brought in $452 million in comparison in revenue this quarter, down around 35% from last quarter. This is after it reported over 10 billion in total losses last year. This is all very bleak, guys, hang with me. But based on where it's at now, this year's losses are set to surpass last year's losses. Yeah, again, this sounds pretty bleak, but Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg said this during the company earnings call. I think we have a little snippet of it. He said, "This is obviously a very expensive undertaking over the next several years, but as the metaverse becomes more important in every part of how we live, I'm confident that we're going to be glad that we played an important role in building this." So it's a very optimistic outlook given the numbers. So I'm going to first toss it to Will for your thoughts on what he said and what all of this means. Like, is the metaverse, dead on arrival, or this is just a hiccup? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that photo of Zuck there kind of feels like he's trying to invite us into his robotic world, right? And I don't know if I want to go myself. I will say from like an entrepreneur standpoint or like a technological standpoint, it makes sense that this is all falling apart right now. And that's part of the game, right? Look at the same thing happened in the 90s with the dot-com bust. Everyone was building all these websites. Everyone was buying whatever URL they could, just thinking that within that you'd have your own business, right? And of course it collapsed, but out of that came a lot of big winners that are still around with us today. Amazon's always the one people like to talk about, but there's many others, of course. And Facebook could be doing the same thing here, right? They're trying to pivot and move into the metaverse landscape with the hopes that in 10 years, 15 years, this is their product. And so right now they're willing to spend the R&D, they're willing to spend the money on this to get themselves to this place. The question, of course, is do people want this? And will people want this in 10 to 15 years? And with the trajectory of people being constantly on their phones, constantly on Twitter, constantly on whatever social media app, it's a pretty good bet. It really is. And there's a lot of people who are using these things immersively right now. So why not in 10 to 15 years more so, right? You'd have to have some sort of reactionary or cooling period against technology for the bet not to work out. Or it's entirely the wrong tech stack and we don't know what is next. But for Facebook to be undergoing this and spending this amount of money on it shows a high level of conviction that is actually appropriate for a founder-led company that is this large. It's actually pretty impressive. It is difficult to move these large behemoths once they get going. These corporations really they keep plowing ahead with what they're good at. And so to see that there's like the leadership and tenacity behind an idea and spending this much money quarter over quarter, and you have to speak to your investors and your shareholders and tell them that you're spending this amount of money and just burning that cash for what could be nothing and could be something in 10 to 15 years. That's a pretty impressive level of conviction in my mind. Adam, I'm going to throw this one over to you for your take.
I mean, I think it's an audacious bet, right? I mean, that's really what we're witnessing here. We're witnessing probably one of the highest stakes bets that I've ever seen. And that bet is on one side that this is going to be a thing, and on the other side that it's not going to be a thing, right? And so to that extent, we don't know if this is a boondoggle yet or just an incredibly shrewd play. But it's worth noting that, Facebook's other business, Facebook, has taken some pretty significant hits over the last number of years as a result of changes made to privacy laws, practices on how Apple phones deal with this type of stuff. They used to make a lot of money off of a very stable ad revenue business, mostly driven by mobile because you couldn't really avoid them. It was harder to avoid where to click. And now that's in large part gone away. And so they are looking for, okay, given our dominant position today, what is the thing that we should bet on in the future? Now, personally, the metaverse, to me, won't actually have much consumer viability until we see headset technology significantly improve from where it is. I remember watching a talk given some 6 or 7 years ago by an executive at a company called Leap that was talking about how in the future, at this point, he was saying 3 years in the future now, 6 or 7 years ago, we would basically have Ray-Ban type sunglasses that just have this technology built into them, and it becomes, as easy as putting on a pair of glasses. When that happens, then I think that suddenly we're going to see a lot of this stuff change. And there are other problems too, like how do you walk around and these types of things, right? Because it's that sort of disconnection from, our physical bodies versus what our eyes see that cause many of the problems about that. So I think there's a lot to be kind of said about this bet, but it's very much that. It's audacious. It probably won't work, but if it does, it'll wind up being one of the biggest coups in business history.